Somewhere in the ancient Near East, a man is walking barefoot on a road that was not meant for kings. His sandals have been left behind. His robe is dusty. His head is bowed. Behind him, an entire city is weeping. Not the quiet weeping of a funeral, the kind that comes when people do not know what is coming next. The man at the front of this procession was, until yesterday, the most powerful person in the region. Today he is running, and the army that forced him to run was not raised by a foreign nation or an ancient enemy. It was assembled by his own son. There is a particular kind of pain that has no name in most languages. The pain of being betrayed by someone you created, someone you fed, someone you loved even when you probably should not have. David was living inside that pain now, step by step, in the dust, on a road heading east. And somewhere far ahead, beyond the Jordan River, in a quiet region that most people in Jerusalem had never thought much about, an old man was about to hear the news. He was 80 years old. He was wealthy. He was under no obligation to move. But he did. And what he chose to do in the days that followed is recorded in the Bible without ceremony, without grand language, without a chapter of its own. Just a few verses. But those verses contain something that is worth reading very slowly. Before we continue, if you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe. Every day we return to the pages of the Bible and spend time with the people in its stories. Some well-known, others often overlooked. Not just the famous names. Not only the great moments everyone already knows, but the people quietly standing in the background, real lives, real choices, and stories that still carry real weight today. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Now let us go back to the story. To understand what Barzillai walked into, you need to understand what had broken down. This was not a border conflict. This was not a war between rival kingdoms. This was a collapse from inside. Absalom was David's son, and the Bible describes him in 2 Samuel 14:25 with unusual specificity. It says, "There was not a man in all Israel as handsome as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him." But that striking exterior carried something deeply wounded beneath it. His sister Tamar had been violated by their half-brother Amnon. David heard about it. He was angry. And then he did nothing. Absalom waited 2 full years while his father stayed silent. He watched the man he was supposed to trust most choose inaction over justice. And then he arranged for Amnon to be killed. What followed was exile, then a slow, permitted return, then a deliberate, patient campaign to win the loyalty of Israel. 2 Samuel 15:6 records exactly how he did it. It says he did this to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. And it says he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Stolen is the right word. Not seized, not demanded. Stolen quietly, person by person, over years. When Absalom finally declared himself king in Hebron, the network behind him was already enormous. A messenger found David with urgent words. "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." David did not try to hold Jerusalem. He called those who were still loyal, and he left the city on foot. 2 Samuel 15 records the procession, his household, his servants, the whole country weeping loudly as he passed. He crossed the Kidron Valley. He went up the Mount of Olives. And then the news arrived that made the situation even more serious. Ahithophel, one of David's most trusted counselors, had joined Absalom. The Bible says in 2 Samuel 16:23 that in those days Ahithophel's counsel was like consulting the word of God. When that man switched sides, David did not just lose an advisor. He lost someone who knew exactly how he thought, and who was now sitting across the table from him. David and his people crossed the Jordan River and arrived at a city called Mahanaim. This was in the region of Gilead, east of the river, in territory that most of the story of David had not touched. The name itself had old roots. Jacob had camped near this place centuries earlier, and in Genesis 32:2, after encountering the angels of God there, he named it Mahanaim, which means two camps. Now it became David's camp, not by choice, but by necessity. His people were in a condition the Bible describes plainly in 2 Samuel 17:29, hungry, weary, thirsty in the wilderness. That is not dramatic language. That is simply what the text records. David still had capable and loyal men around him. Joab was there. Skilled warriors were there. But a body cannot fight without food. This is the moment in the story where three men appear. 2 Samuel 17:27 through 29 records their arrival without introduction or explanation. Three men came to David at Mahanaim. The first was Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites. The second was Machir, the son of Amiel from Lodebar. This was the same Machir who had been caring for Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, before David brought him to Jerusalem. And the third was Barzillai the Gileadite, from a place called Rogelim. Together, they brought what the Bible records, in careful, unhurried detail: beds and basins and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, and parched grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds and sheep and cheese. Read through that list without rushing it. This was not symbolic. This was not a polite gesture sent from a comfortable distance. This was organized, practical, substantial provision for a large group of exhausted people. Beds for those who could not stand. Food for those who had not eaten. Vessels to carry and store water. The Bible gives the reason at the end of that same passage. Because the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. No conditions are recorded, no negotiation, no political arrangement stated. The need was visible. These three men responded to it. Here is something the text does not say directly, even though the surrounding context makes it impossible to ignore. Coming to David at this moment was not a safe or neutral act. Absalom had declared himself king. He had broad popular support across Israel. His forces were organized, funded, and moving. When Barzillai and the others walked to Mahanaim with supplies for David, they were making a visible public choice about which side they stood on, before anyone knew how the story would end. If Absalom won, they would be remembered as men who had sided against the new king, in the ancient world that carried real and serious consequences. The Bible does not record that Barzillai gave a speech about this calculation. There is no account of him weighing the odds or drafting conditions before he moved. The text simply says he came. And in 2 Samuel 19:32, we're given one more detail about him. It describes Barzillai as a very wealthy man. A man with substantial wealth and standing has more to lose than a man with nothing to his name. He had land. He had resources. He had influence in his region. And he brought those resources to a king who currently had nothing, in a situation where the outcome was genuinely unknown. The Bible does not tell us what was in his heart. We should not pretend to know. But we know what he chose to do. He came to a king who had nothing, and he gave from what he had before the result was clear. There is one detail in this story that most people read past without pausing. Barzillai was 80 years old. 2 Samuel 19:32 gives us that number plainly, without comment. The Bible does not explain how Barzillai was still physically capable and active at 80. It simply records that he was. What is worth noticing is what he did not do. He did not send a servant in his place with the supplies. He did not delegate the journey to someone younger while he stayed home. Rogelim, the town where Barzillai lived, is mentioned only twice in the entire Bible, both times in connection with him. Its precise location is still debated among biblical scholars, which means we cannot state the exact distance he traveled to reach Mahanaim. But whatever that distance was, an 80-year-old man made that journey himself and arrived in person. He showed up. That is the kind of detail that does not announce itself loudly. It sits in the text quietly, waiting for someone to actually stop and notice it. The battle between David's forces and Absalom's army took place in the forest of Ephraim. 2 Samuel 18 records what happened. David's men were outnumbered, but they were experienced, seasoned, and fighting for a king they had followed through years of both wilderness and palace. The terrain worked against Absalom's larger force. The forest was dense and uneven, and the Bible records that the forest devoured more people that day than the sword did. Absalom's forces were broken, and Absalom himself did not survive. He was riding his mule through the trees when his head caught in the branches of an oak. His mule kept moving beneath him. He was left hanging there, suspended. Joab found him and killed him. When the news was carried to David, what followed surprised many of the people around him. It was not relief. It was not a moment of victory. 2 Samuel 18:33 records his words. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." He had won. His kingdom was preserved. His enemies were scattered, and he was completely undone. He was a king who had just survived a dangerous threat to his reign, weeping for the son who had created it. Because no political outcome could reach that deep into a father's heart and change what was there. After the victory, the return to Jerusalem began. The negotiations were complicated. Tensions ran between tribes. Arguments broke out over who had been loyal and who deserved credit. But one moment in the middle of all that stands entirely apart. As David came to the Jordan to cross back west, Barzillai came down from Rogelim to meet him at the river. 2 Samuel 19:31 says he came to escort David across the Jordan. He had come to David when David was fleeing. Now he came again to walk beside him on the way back. Same man, same direction toward the king. One journey into darkness, one journey into restoration. David saw this old man standing there at the river. He had fed him in the wilderness. He had shown up when showing up was costly. And now he had come a second time, simply to accompany a returning king to the crossing. And David made him an offer. 2 Samuel 19:33 records his exact words. "Come over with me, and I will provide for you with me in Jerusalem." This was a genuine invitation, not a formality. Jerusalem was the center of the kingdom. To live there as a guest of the king meant security, comfort, and honor for the rest of his life. For a man who had done what Barzillai had done, it was a deserved and meaningful recognition. In most stories like this, the one who helped gladly accepts the honor. You help someone in their darkest moment. They recover. They offer you a place at their table. You sit down. The story ends warmly. But Barzillai did not accept. His response is recorded in 2 Samuel 19:34 through 37. He begins simply, "How many years do I still have that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem?" He is not rejecting David. He is not performing humility for an audience. He is asking an honest question about his own remaining life. Then he continues, "I am this day 80 years old. Can I discern what is pleasant and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats or what he drinks? Can I still listen to the voice of singing men and singing women?" He is not mourning his age. He is naming his limits plainly, without self-pity and without embellishment. He knows what he can no longer experience the way he once could. Then comes the sentence that makes this response genuinely remarkable. Why then should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? He is not fishing for David to say, of course you would not be a burden. He is not performing false modesty. He is telling the truth about himself. And that truth is freeing him from needing to take what he is being offered. Then he says where he wants to go. Let your servant return, that I may die in my own city near the grave of my father and my mother. He wants to die at home, in the land he knows, near the people who came before him. That is not sadness. That is a man who knows exactly where he belongs and is completely at peace with it. He had given freely, and now he was going home freely. But before he goes, Barzillai makes one request. It is in the second part of 2 Samuel 19:37. He asks David to take Chimham with him instead. The Bible does not explicitly identify Chimham's relationship to Barzillai. Most biblical scholars and commentators understand him to be Barzillai's son, but the text does not state this directly. What is clear is what Barzillai is doing here. David wanted to honor him. Barzillai knew he could not use that honor in the way it was being offered. So he did not leave it unclaimed. He placed it in hands that could actually receive it. David agreed. He took Chimham with him to Jerusalem. And then something appears that many readers might miss, because it is mentioned in a completely different book of the Bible, written centuries later. Centuries later, the prophet Jeremiah is writing in a very different time, long after David, long after Barzillai, long after Chimham. In Jeremiah 41:17, within an account of a group fleeing toward Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem, the text mentions a stopping place. It calls it the lodging place of Chimham, near Bethlehem. Read that slowly, a real location, carrying that name. Mentioned centuries after Barzillai stood at the Jordan and redirected the reward offered to him. The Bible does not explain how that place received its name, but the connection is difficult to overlook. The honor Barzillai declined for himself became associated with the one he entrusted it to, and that name remained in the land for generations. Barzillai was not trying to build a legacy when he stood at that river. He was simply honest about what he could not receive and generous with what he could still give. And yet something from that quiet, unremarkable exchange endured. Not because he engineered it, but because sometimes what remains is what was given freely. Without clinging to it, 2 Samuel 19:39 closes this part of the account in one brief, unhurried sentence. The king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his own home. A kiss, a blessing, a man walking back toward Rogelim. The Bible does not tell us how many years he had left. It does not record his final words or describe his homecoming. It simply says he went home. But this story has one more thread. Years pass. David is old and dying. He is speaking to his son Solomon for the last time. He gives him several instructions, some of them difficult. And then, in the middle of those final words, he says this, 1 Kings 2:7. Deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom your brother. David remembered. At the very end of his life, with everything he had lived through, he specifically and clearly remembered an old man from Gilead who came to him in the wilderness with food and beds and earthen vessels. He remembered it precisely enough to make it one of his final spoken instructions to his son, not recorded in a law, not written in an official document, spoken quietly from a dying man to his heir. That is what a genuine act of generosity can leave behind. not a monument built in stone. A memory alive enough to travel through the years and arrive in someone's last words. Barzillai was not a prophet. He received no visions. He is not described in the Bible as a man of God in the way that phrase is typically used. He was a wealthy man from an eastern region who showed up at the right time with the right things. That was his role. And according to the biblical record, it was sufficient. We tend to measure spiritual contribution by how visible and exceptional it appears. We assume that God uses the dramatic moment, the large platform, the striking calling. Barzillai had none of those things as we tend to imagine them. He had resources, access, and the ability to recognize a real need when he saw one. And he chose to act on it, at a moment when acting was costly, without attaching any conditions. The ordinary act, done faithfully at the right moment, with no strings attached, is not a lesser form of faith. It is simply a less celebrated one. And the biblical record, in its quiet way, shows us that God does not share our bias toward the spectacular. He recorded what Barzillai brought to Mahanaim in detail: beds, basins, beans and lentils, honey and cheese. He recorded it the same way he recorded the building of the tabernacle, because what was given mattered, even if it did not look like much from the outside. There is a pattern in this story that becomes clearer the more carefully you look at it. Barzillai gave before he knew the outcome. David had not won. Absalom's forces were still advancing. The battle had not been fought. And yet Barzillai came to Mahanaim with organized, substantial provision. He did not wait for David to prove he was worth backing. He looked at the need and moved toward it, carrying the full risk of being on the losing side. That kind of giving is harder than it looks, because it comes with no guarantee of return. Then, when the battle ended and David won, the offer of reward was placed directly in front of him. And Barzillai let it go, not with bitterness, not with a performance of self-denial, with calm, honest self-knowledge. He knew what he needed, and he knew what he did not. He knew what season of life he was in, and he did not pretend otherwise. These two things together, giving into uncertainty and then releasing the outcome when it came, form something that is genuinely rare in a person. Most people can do one or the other. They can give generously and then wait to see what comes back. Or they can refuse rewards gracefully, but only because they had already decided they would refuse. Barzillai did both from the same heart. He gave because the need was real. He refused because the reward no longer matched his life. And in between those two moments, there was no calculation, no performance, no quiet accounting. Just a person who was free. The world of this story is 3,000 years behind us, but the human patterns inside it walk into the present very naturally. Think about how people typically respond when someone close to them is going through something serious. Not a minor inconvenience. Something genuinely hard. A lost job that has become a lost identity. A marriage that is quietly falling apart. An illness that is taking longer than anyone expected. In those situations, many people do what feels safe. They send a message saying they are thinking of the person. They say, "Let me know if you need anything." And then they wait. Barzillai did not say, "Let me know if you need anything." He assessed the actual need, organized the specific provision, and made the journey himself. He did not wait for David to ask. That is a different posture entirely, and it is much harder to sustain because it requires you to stay present with someone else's difficulty long enough to understand what it actually looks like. The second parallel is more uncomfortable. Many of us keep a quiet account of what we have given to the people around us. We remember the time we drove someone to the hospital at 2 in the morning. We remember when we lent money that was never returned. We remember showing up when no one else did. And somewhere in us, that record exists. We may not mention it, but we know it is there. When Barzillai was offered the reward at the Jordan, he was completely free to say no. Not because he was performing generosity, but because he genuinely had not been carrying it. That kind of freedom from our own giving is not something most people experience naturally. It grows slowly in a person who has decided, quietly and repeatedly over time, that giving is complete in itself. The third parallel is about a kind of courage that almost never gets named as courage. We tend to reserve that word for dramatic moments. But there is a form of courage in showing up for someone when it is genuinely inconvenient. When your support is not guaranteed to be appreciated. When the person may not recover. When you may end up standing on the side that loses. An 80-year-old man, with every reason to stay home, organized supplies, and traveled to where the need was. Not because he was fearless, but because he had decided that the need in front of him mattered more than the risk behind it. That quiet decision, made without an audience, is available to every person reading this right now. It does not require a dramatic calling. It requires you to see the need and move toward it before you know how the story ends. This story does not close with a formula. It closes with questions that deserve honest answers. The first is simple and direct. Is there someone in your life right now who is in their wilderness? Not struggling in a minor way, genuinely exhausted, running on something close to empty. Do you know what they actually need? Not what you assume they need, and not what would be easiest for you to offer. What do they actually need right now? Barzillai answered that question by paying attention. He brought beds because people needed to rest. He brought food because people needed to eat. He brought the specific thing, not the convenient thing. That is worth asking yourself this week. The second question is about freedom. When you give something, do you give it completely? Or do you give it while quietly holding one end of it, tracking whether it was acknowledged, waiting for the account to be settled? There is nothing shameful about wanting to be appreciated. But there is something freeing about giving something and then genuinely releasing it. Not monitoring it, not cataloging it, not folding it into your sense of what you are owed. Just letting it go and walking home. The third question is about honesty. He told a king the truth about his own limits. He said, I am 80. I cannot taste. I cannot hear. I would be a burden to you, not bitterly, not as a performance, just honestly. Are you that honest with yourself about your own life right now? About what season you are in? About what you can give and what you genuinely cannot? That kind of self-knowledge is not weakness. In the scripture's view, it consistently appears alongside wisdom. David kissed Barzillai. He blessed him. And the old man turned and walked back toward Rogelim. The Bible does not follow him home. It does not record what his family said when he arrived. It does not tell us how many more years he lived, or whether he ever spoke about those days in the wilderness when an exhausted king arrived and an old man showed up with food. It simply says he went home. He had made his decision before the outcome was known. He had given without holding on to what he gave. He had refused a reward honestly and passed it to someone who could use it. And in the years that followed, a lodging place near Bethlehem bore the name of Chimham. Not because Barzillai set out to build a legacy, but because sometimes what is given freely leaves something that endures. Then, years later, at the end of his own life, a dying king lay on his bed and spoke his final words to his son. He covered several matters. And then, among his last instructions, he said, "Deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite," because he showed that kind of loyalty to me when I had nothing. Those words traveled from a dying man's lips across 3,000 years of recorded history. They arrived in the pages of 1 Kings, and they arrive here today. The Bible does not give Barzillai a title. It does not call him a hero or a prophet or one of the great men of Israel. It simply records what he did. An 80-year-old man from a region most people never thought about. He showed up when he was needed. He gave what he had. He said no to what no longer fit him. He went home, and he was remembered. Not in marble, not in ceremony. In a dying king's last words to his son. In a place near Bethlehem that bore a name. In a story that has carried itself quietly through 3,000 years and arrived today, here. There is a kind of life that does not reach for the spotlight and yet leaves something real behind it. It does not require greatness. It requires a person who sees the need, moves toward it, gives without conditions, and is honest about who they are. Barzillai was that person. The question this story leaves behind is a simple one. Are you? If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone today. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment below and tell us what stood out to you from Barzillai's account. And if this video meant something to you, a like takes 1 second and helps more people find it. We will see you in the next story.